Hi everyone, Rory here, and in this session I'm going to show you all about PowerFX number functions for use in your Canvas apps and anywhere else that you might choose to be using PowerFX. So we're going to start off by looking at a simple function called rand, because this will generate a random number for us, and then we'll move on to working with some rounding functions. Then we'll move on to using the int and trunc, which are different kinds of rounding functions that you may come across. Then we'll move on to the absolute function, which will actually change a negative through to a positive, which can be useful. We'll also look at the value function along the way, and we'll also see the IsNumeric functions, which will tell us whether or not something is or is not numeric. We're then going to move on to looking at the cos functions. So these are trigonometry functions. They can be useful. I typically use them when I'm trying to make some things sort of glow and fade and things like that. So it's kind of fun. And the sine function, acos, they work in the same way. We're also going to look at the mod function, which is a divisor function, which you can use to make things change color depending on which row they are and so on. You'll see that when we come to it. And then we're going to go over to the sum, max, and average functions, which are quite unusual functions because you can also use them using a table as well. So sometimes it's kind of looking at table fields and it will run the operation over those entries. And then sometimes it's actually looking across a specific field within a table or a function, a formula within a table as well. So what we're then going to do is we're then going to look at the Countrows function. That's a really super function, and that will then take us to the end of the session. So there's loads and loads of really useful functions in here, and I really recommend that you make use of them. But now we're just going to go across to the intro. I'm starting this off on a blank canvas. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring a text input onto the screen. So there goes my text input, and into that we're going to put some values so that we can then work out what the behavior should be. I did mention straight away that I would use the rand function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a label here. It's currently saying text. If I use the rand function, what it'll do is it will spit out a random value, and actually it will just hold it there. And if I was actually to delete this and then put it back on again, it would generate a different random number. That's kind of interesting. Another way of using that is if you want to sort of generate a little bit of data, is you can kind of go into a gallery, pop a vertical gallery in there. You can then sort of go on to the layout and then just put the title in there. And what you can then do is put something like a sequence. And what that does is it generates a list of numbers. So let's say we want to generate 5 numbers in there. It's just going to generate 1 through to 5. So what I'm going to do is it's going to should be this item dot value. We'll see 1 through to 5. But what you can actually do is you can do an add columns on there. So add columns, and then what you can do is you do add columns, column name, which is going to be my rand, and then what is it going to be? And it's going to be rand, and then close the brackets and close the brackets again. And then what would happen there is if I actually put in another field there, I would do this item dot my rand, and what I would see is be a series of random numbers, and we can use that later on to do some a little bit of work on that. So what I'm going to do now is on this text input here, I'm actually going to go onto the screen and change the number there. So let's just say it was 2.356. Take a nice simple number there. And what we're going to do here is we're going to go and create another label here, and what we're going to do is some rounding exercises. So what we can do is let's just check this the text input name. So what I'll do is we do txt, let's call it txt lesson. So, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, actually, do you know what? I want you to round txt lesson dot text. Remember, it's dot text as well. It doesn't actually know that it's a number, and we'll have to tell it how many digits to round it to. Now notice there is actually an error in here. We'll carry on with this. We're going to round it to 1 decimal place. In fact, looking at this, we've actually lost our text input. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop this in here. And I'm going to say 2.365. That should be within some quotes there, because it's actually text. And that's the reason why this thing is failing here. So what we'll do is we'll say, well, actually, no, we're going to convert that into a value. And then we will do the rounding operation on that. So you can see it's actually rounded it to 2.4, and that's actually the correct value. We could have just as easily done a round down, and that's done to 1 decimal place. And this time round, it's actually rounded to 2.3. We can have a little interesting exercise here, and what we can actually do is make it minus 2.3, and this does actually generate some interesting variations here. So it's actually rounded it down, but it's actually nearer to 0. And what we'll see is we can do the round up as well. So let's go round up, and we will see that it actually rounds it up, actually away from the 0. Now that isn't necessarily the same as what the int function will do. The int function is slightly different. So what we'll do is we'll bring in another label there, and what we're actually going to do is we'll do int and then value txt lesson. Now that one doesn't actually need an extra variable there. So that one, now well, this one is an interesting one. What this one actually does is let's just go and check the documentation around that, because it's actually subtly different to the truncate function. So look at the documentation here, the int and trunc functions. This is really subtle here, is that int rounds down to the nearest integer, truncate rounds to the number, just to the integer portion by removing a decimal portion. Now the thing with this is what really happens is it's when it goes negative that things start to be a little bit strange. So what we'll see is on here is that the int function will make it further away from 0. That's the idea of rounding down, at least in this case it is. So what we'll see is if we actually move back to Power Apps, and we do the int function, you actually notice that minus 2.365 goes to minus 3. And then what we'll see is the trunc version of the same thing. We'll go to minus 2. But actually, if we kind of change that to be positive, and then we use the trunc function, and then we use the int function, what we should see is the int function does actually make it 2. It's subtly different. Honestly, it's not often that you'll actually come across this. You're probably better off using the round functions anyway, but you may find you get some performance gains here. Now, the next one I'd like to look at is the absolute function, and that one is the one that actually converts things to being either minus or plus or minus, essentially. So what I'm going to do here is I will just show you, pop that onto the screen here, and what I will do is just do ABS, and that's going to be the absolute of what's in there. And it's just going to do the absolute of that. Now, it only actually matters when you go into there and you actually say, do you know what, I'm going to make you minus. And what you'll see here is that this doesn't actually change the value at all. It actually stays as 2.365. And it can be really, really useful in certain circumstances that you actually don't want things to go negative. It's quite mathematical, the circumstances where that applies, but even so, it is quite useful. So we have seen the value function. In fact, we've been using it the whole way along here. So that's the thing that actually takes a text, something within text. So if we kind of go on to here and we actually say something like, hello world, that's actually, destroyed things somewhat. Let's just see what happens when we use the value function, the value of txt lesson.text. Let's see what happens to you. In fact, it really struggles with this. But let's be honest, it's really probably not a great scenario. But what you will find is that you should find that your text values will be converted into a number, and that can be extremely useful. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do an IsNumeric field, and this is just really a true false thing. So what I'm going to do is you're going to go onto here, move this across over here, and what I will do is I will pop in a label, and I will then say IsNumeric, and I'll do and it's going to be, I think this is called title 3.1. So IsNumeric title 3.1. In fact, it wouldn't actually be that. It would actually be this item dot my rand, and what I should expect to find is going to be true. Whereas if I did something like if I did the same thing and popped a label in there and went to IsNumeric and I want txt lesson.text, we're expecting it to say no because look, it's a text field, so it's going to say false, and that can be useful in some circumstances. So that has taken us through there. Now the next one is a lot of fun, because the next one we're actually going to use some trigonometry functions. They're kind of interesting to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a new screen on here and pop a blank screen on. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to use the trigonometry functions. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to pop and insert a timer onto the screen. So I'm going to go on to insert and hit the plus and then do timer and then pop one of those on the screen. And what I'm going to do is make the duration say something like, let's make it 3000. Which is 3 seconds. So what we can do is pop it on the screen there and it will just play for 3 seconds. And that's fine. So what we can do with that is we can actually pump out a number. So if I go onto the pop a label onto the screen, and it's called timer 1, so it's going to be timer 1 dot value. So and what we'll see is if we actually press the play button, we actually see the value. Now what we can also do is timer 1 dot value divided by timer 1 dot duration, and what we'll see then is we'll end up with effectively a decimal version of that. So effectively it moves from 0 through to 1 as the timer progresses. So the question is, why would I want to do that? And the reason why I want to do that is I'm sort of demonstrating to you that there's a particular when I use the cost version of that, we'll actually see the numbers change. Now what I want to do is I want to effectively attach that to maybe I'll just do something simple like a slider. So let me do a slider on the screen. So insert a slider, pop that on the screen, and the value is going to be default is 50. Let's see if we want to actually do this. Yes, we'll give it a little go. So what we're going to do is we're going to go onto the default, and then we're going to make it we'll do self dot max and multiplied by we'll do timer 1 divided by dot value divided by timer 1 dot, and it's going to be duration. So what we should find is actually just moves all the way up in a linear fashion all the way up to 1. Now what we can do with that is actually say, do you know what, that's not great. We can actually say, well actually what I want to do with that is I want to just do the cos version of that. Now what that will do is it will actually make it go in a slightly different fashion. So actually you notice that it's actually starting at the top, and what you see is that it goes faster and then goes slower. Now this is a slightly different one that we've got going on here because it's actually only going to get all the way down to 50. But the idea is that you can actually produce a value. So what I'm going to do here is to pop another button on the screen, pop the button on there, and then what we'll do is we'll look at the fill property and we'll do change the intensity to be cos of the timer 1 dot value over timer 1 dot duration, and then close the brackets and close the brackets again. And what we'll see is that we should start to see the intensity changing over time. So let's actually have a look at that. And you can see the intensity is changing a little bit. It's not a perfect formula, but it's enough for us to understand that we can actually have a relationship using the cos function. What I'd now like to do is I'd like to move back to the other screen, because what I want to show you is the mod function. There is a kind of fun little way of us using this. So let's look on this screen here. We know we've got a simple gallery here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of some of these items here just to simplify matters. We'll make the screen go up a little bit more here, and we'll make the sequence a little bit longer. Let's make it something like 15. That just about goes onto the screen there, because what I'm going to do this time round is I'm going to use the mod function to change the color of the rows. So what I want to do is I want to go on to the fill property, but it's the fill property of the item there. So let's have a look at this. Template fill. So what we can do on that is we can use the mod function to make it kind of be one color and then another color and so on. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to show you on the screen what the mod function is going to do. And what we're going to do is going to be mod this item. It's going to be dot value. And we're going to effectively divide it by 2 and then close the brackets. So notice now we get 1 0 1 0 1 0, and essentially what it's doing is it's dividing it by 2 and telling us what the remainder is. Now what we can do with that number is we can then make the fill property change as we go through it. So what we can do is we can grab this formula, we can go onto this item here, go onto the template fill, and what we can do is if that equals 1, then let's say light grey. Otherwise do something like transparent. And then close the brackets there. And what we've seen now is we've used that mod function to change that around. Now what you could do, I'm not necessarily I'd say I'd recommend it, would be you can actually change it so that it's actually not divided by 2 anymore. It's actually divided by 3. So it's going to be every third one that's going to go grey. I'm not sure if there's a great use for that, but it's just illustrating that that's what this function actually does. So it's a peculiar function. You take a number, you divide it by another number, and it just tells you the remainder. That's all it does. What we're now going to do is look at some slightly more mathematical functions. So what I'm going to do with that is I'm actually going to remove this thing here because I don't need it anymore. And let's look at this thing here. And I want to look at the items on here. Items. Because I don't really want 15 anymore. I think 5 is plenty. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I'm going to squeeze this up a little bit and move it down a bit. And we're going to do some functions which do a little bit of addition. So what we're going to do is we're going to pop a little label into here. So we'll do a label, and it's decided to do rand again. And what we're going to do is I'm going to say sum. In fact, it's just as easy for the idea of summing things to go and put a label straight on the screen and actually say, do you know what? This text can be sum, open brackets, and it can be 1, 2, 3, and that's all it is. It's just going to add those numbers together. And what that really means is that if we went onto something like this item dot myrand and this item dot value, it's going to add those two fields together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just make it a little bit bigger here, and I'm going to pop another label on the screen, and I am just going to make it this item dot value, and what you'll see is it's supposed to be this item dot rand. So we can see on the screen it's 1 plus 0.3091 is 1 point so on. You can see it just adds those two things together. And what we'll see later on is that we can actually add, instead of doing it this way, we can actually add the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever is in your field at that time. So what I'm now going to do is I can actually do things, you know, other operations here. So move that one across. Instead of doing that, I can do the max. That's going to be just be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But maybe I can do this item dot value, let's say divided by 5, something like that. You actually see it's a bit of a difference going on there, because actually 1 divided by 5 is 0.2, so 0.3 is the maximum value, whereas the 2 divided by 5 is 0.4, so that's a maximum there. So we've got different maximums going in there, and we can also do things like average. So of these two fields, so it'll add the two fields together and then divide by 2. In fact, that's actually still got the divide by 5 in there, so it's a little bit confusing. But you can see it's actually the 1.3 divided by 2 equals the 0.65, and so on and so forth. So that is the purely mathematical side of things working in that way. But now what we need to do is actually have a look at what it takes for us to be able to actually look at a specific field and then do the same operations using sum, max and average. So the very first one I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this one here, move it across here, and I'm going to do sum, and I'm going to do gallery. In fact, it's going to be, I'm going to call it gal lesson. So I'm going to say, actually, do you know what I want you to do is I'm going to do sum gal lesson dot all items, and then what am I going to sum? And I'm actually going to sum the value because it's nice and easy. So it's going to add them all together. So I've got 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 equals 15. That's fairly easy to do. In fact, it's even kind of nicer if I make this even smaller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, instead of the sequence be 5, I'm going to make it 3. That's nice and easy. You can still see it adds it up. And then now what I'm going to do is, instead of it making it sum, I can do the max. Well, that's nice and easy. We're expecting it to be 3. That was easy. And then similarly, we can actually do the average of those there, which I'm pretty sure is going to be 2. So average, and close the brackets there and do 2. So you can see it's actually working across all the rows. And in fact, you can do silly things in here. So what you could actually do is you could do average of gallery lessons and all items value, and you can actually add another row in there if you wanted to. And let's just try this one out, times value. Yeah, so you can actually do the average of the square of those two values here. It's a bit of an odd thing that you might want to do, but hey, you know, this is mathematical, so they can happen in all sorts of ways. Now the final number function that I'm going to show you this time around is the count rows function. The count rows can be really, really useful to you because you might be filtering things and you might be ending up with different numbers of rows in your gallery, and therefore you would end up wanting to summarize it in a certain way. So my way of doing that would be pop a little text label on there. I'm going to go onto there and I'm going to say, well, actually count rows, and then it's going to be gal lesson dot all items, close the brackets, then close the brackets, and it's done it's added those rows together. And what you could also do is, the sort of time that you might start using this is when you kind of like maybe put a button on the screen, pop a button on the screen, and what we could do is I could do something like collect, and we could do call demo, and I'll put this item, something like that. And so what I could do is, instead of it being count rows of gal lesson all items, it could be call demo. So that's going to be a 0 to begin with, but actually if I go onto the demo and I click the button there and then the button there, in fact I can hit the button there again and again and again, it's actually counting the rows that are within that collection. And you would be amazed at how useful it is to be able to do the count rows operation. So we've covered an awful lot of ground in this session. We've covered loads and loads of number functions. I hope you feel a little bit more able to actually go through these in the future. We've actually covered the round function. That was nice and easy, gave us a nice random number to play with, round up, round down, and so on. We used the int and trunc function. We saw that they didn't actually behave in quite the same way, depending on whether they were positive or negative. We used the absolute function to convert a negative into a positive, which can definitely be useful in the future. We were using value a lot of the way through this to actually convert text into value. IsNumeric is just a true false to say whether or not something is a number or not. And then we actually use the cos function, which I did spend a little bit of time on, I'm afraid. I apologize for that, but it can be really good fun to use. So that can be fun. And we also use the mod function. We use it mainly to show that we can actually have different colored rows in a gallery, which is quite a nice effect. And then finally, we moved on to some the summing functions, so the mathematical functions, and we saw that we can actually use those within a table in order to perform mathematical operations over an entire field within that particular thing. So the final thing we looked at was the count rows operation, which I use all of the time. It's so useful to be able to know how many rows, even if you're testing things out. It's really useful. There we are. We got to the end of the PowerFX number functions. I hope you liked it. And do remember, there's actually a similar video put together on text functions. I really like it. There's about 18 text functions that I cover in there in a pretty short period of time. So if you've got any comments on what you've seen so far, do let me know down below. And if you like this sort of thing, make sure you like it and then subscribe it, and make sure that you hit the bell so you get to find out about any new videos as soon as they come out. Have a lovely day, and I'll see you sometime soon.